All right, my friends, welcome back to Antiwar Radio for Radio Chaos 95.9 FM in Austin, Texas, and antiwar.com. Introducing Andrew Cockburn. He's a writer and lecturer on defense and national affairs. He's also the author of 5 nonfiction books. He's written for the New York Times, The New Yorker, Playboy, Vanity Fair, and National Geographic, among other publications. Currently lives in Washington, D.C., and is the author of this excellent book, Rumsfeld, His Rise, Fall, and Catastrophic Legacy. This will be our follow-up interview to part 1 we did last week. Welcome back to the show, Andrew.
Hi, glad to be with you again.
Yes, good to have you back on the show, sir. The book is so good, and I wanted to talk about so much out of the book that we really didn't even get to talk about Iraq or transformation dogma or any of these kinds of things. So I'm really glad I have this opportunity to follow up with part 2. And if it's okay with you, I want to start this one actually in the same place we started last week, which is August of 2006. George Bush is at his dad's house in Maine, and people should remember that he's from Connecticut. He's not really a Texan, but he's up there with his father in Kennebunkport. And what happens?
Well, they go out for a walk, and the son says, "Dad, can I ask you a question?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "What's a neocon?" And the father says, "Do you want names or a description?" And President Bush Jr. says, "I'll take a description." And the father says, "I'll give it to you in one word, Israel." So from that we learn, well, a number of things. We learn that that George Bush had managed to get to get through 5.5 years, or get to it, and get into middle age without knowing what a neocon was, and that the father thought the neocons were all about Israel.
Yeah, well, and really you're right. Okay, first of all, Junior somehow lasted through August of 2006 without so much as Googling the word neocon to find out what the hell all the rest of us were talking about.
Well, our president is not noted for his curiosity. I mean, people say he's not dumb. I don't know. People keep saying, "Oh, he's not really dumb." I'm always waiting for the evidence on that. He seems to have a kind of a manipulative cunning, which I guess some people think stands in for smart. But,
yeah.
And I'm glad you mentioned that he's not from Texas. He's this preppy from Greenwich, Connecticut. Dixie Chicks would have saved themselves a lot of trouble if they'd remembered that. But anyway,
yeah, exactly. And I'm tired of apologizing for the guy.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Because I am from Texas.
Exactly, a great state. So, well, yeah. So he's just not very curious. He takes pride in not reading the newspapers. He says he gets all his information from his coterie at court. That would be, I don't know, Condoleezza Rice, Cheney, Rumsfeld.
Let me ask you something. Well, this has come up in the context of the guy who refused to be the war czar and wrote in the Washington Post that, well, it's because there's no connection between the tactics on the ground and the strategy in the long term, and nobody up there has any idea where they're going at all. And I'm reminded of Bob Woodward's book, where he writes about Andrew Card debating whether to replace Rumsfeld with James Baker. And it's reading Woodward, so what are you going to do, But in reading, and it's State of Denial, the last one, in reading that book, you would think that Andrew Card had no idea that there was some sort of factional difference or real strategic or belief system difference between James Baker and Donald Rumsfeld at all.
Yeah, well,
he was just thinking, well, Baker seems like a pretty qualified guy. How about him? Like, these people have no idea about the things that you and I talk about all the time.
Well, right, but also you wouldn't want to take that a bit too seriously. I mean, it didn't really matter what Andrew Card thought, if indeed he did think that. Andrew Card, all those people, to Bush and to Cheney and to Rumsfeld, Rumsfeld as it was then anyway, these people were just the help, Card and Bolton and all these sort of weenies around the White House. Rumsfeld would treat Card with total contempt. He would ring him up and he'd chew him out, say, "You're the worst chief of staff in history. When I was chief of staff of the White House, I would have been ashamed to make the screw-ups you're making." Just speak to him. He would go on like that. I've, I've had a good account of someone who was in the room in Card's office and could hear Rumsfeld was yelling so loud he could hear him over the phone. So these people would, they couldn't give two hoots what people like Card thought. All of them.
Yeah.
Gonzalez, Myers, they're all just. Not to say they don't manipulate. Well, Rove can sort of manipulate Bush, and Bush responds to that by he'll sort of shout at Rove, and on one occasion I think he's been seen to send Rove out to walk Barney the dog. But that's really to obscure the fact that he's actually doing what Rove tells. Politically, he's sort of manipulated by Rove. But the big guys, Rove is still one down. The big guys, were Cheney and Rumsfeld, and they were the people who, for years and years. Now things have changed a bit now since Rumsfeld went and Scooter Libby's headed for the jailhouse, because Libby was so important in keeping the Cheney shop organized, so things have fallen apart a bit since then.
Right.
But they, for years, these three guys, Bush, Rumsfeld, and Cheney, just ran the world with disastrous consequences. It's one of the things I talk about in the book.
Now, when going back to Bush and his conversation with his father last summer, and his father's one-word answer, Israel, that's the definition of a neocon. That's hardly a sufficient definition. So what exactly is a neocon?
Well, I argue in the book, I go back to we're going back to the early Rumsfeld years again, but I give, which not many people, in fact, very, very few people know how the neocons really how they became a big, potent political force, which was really the brainchild of a guy called Paul Nitzer, who was a crafty, rather sinister sort of insider who for years and years and years and years, from 1950 on, he was the guy who really, he did a lot to accelerate and the Cold War arms race and keep it running at a high tempo. And he made his life's work really to jack up keep the tensions high and the defense budget up. And in the early 70s or mid 70s, he had a real, had a very interesting insight, fateful insight, which was he realized that if you put together the pro-Israel lobby, which was traditionally dovish on things that weren't to do with Israel, like they were very dovish about Vietnam, things like that. If you put them together with the defense lobby, the military-industrial complex, then you'd have an amazingly powerful alliance. And that's what he did. He persuaded the Israelis, these Israel supporters, or this group of Israel supporters, that, a dollar for defense meant 10 cents for Israel. And so it went. And that's really where that was the neocons. I know that very well. And Rumsfeld made his alliance with these people. And, it's an alliance that really lasted until last year, when the neocons, realizing that their project had, resulted in utter total disaster, and people might begin to notice who was responsible, were quick to say it was all Rumsfeld's fault. And, so it wasn't us, it was Rumsfeld just carried it out so badly, and, that's it, and don't blame us.
Right, which is what they're still saying to this day.
Yeah.
Now, if there's one complaint I can make about this book, I think it's there's very little about Rumsfeld's connection to Cheney after becoming Secretary of Defense again and through the Iraq War and that sort of deal.
Well, okay, I wanted to keep it a short book that people could read in an evening, but you got me there. But what can I say? They're very, they're close. They were close. I think I talked about this last week, so I won't go into it again. But they had a falling out in the 80s, late 80s, when Cheney refused to help Rumsfeld's presidential bid, and Rumsfeld went into a kind of snit for a while.
And that lasted even through the last few years?
No. But they weren't, they weren't these. I think that the bond, it's hard to sort of exactly grade it. People who talked to Cheney, when they were looking for a Secretary of Defense and decided on Rumsfeld, I've talked to people who talked to Cheney about Rumsfeld at that time. This is late 2000, and they said that, and I do talk about this in the book. They said that that he was kind of dispassionate. He wasn't saying, "Hey, I got a great idea. I'm going to make my old buddy Don Secretary of Defense." It was like a dispassionate conversation about, what do you think of Don Rumsfeld? What do you think his pluses and minuses and things like that? So they, I think it was as they embarked on this great enterprise to, reduce the Middle East to utter chaos and all the other disastrous things they were doing. I think the bond sort of deepened. I mean, now they're next door neighbors. Cheney had this place out on the eastern shore in St. Michael's in Maryland, and then Rumsfeld bought the house next door. And you don't buy the house next door to someone that you know unless you figure unless you're on reasonably good terms with them.
So you think through the war, operationally, that they were working together, talking often, and that sort of thing? Yeah,
talking often. And there was, the alliances. I mean, I want to, digress for a second to talk about another connection between that was going out from the White House, from the Defense Department, which was Paul Wolfowitz. He was very close to Cheney, close to Cheney's deputy chief of staff, Scooter Libby. I happen to know that he'd have long conversations with Scooter Libby almost every night.
Right. Karen Kotowski said that they would come up with some phony intelligence and say, "I've got to get this over to Scooter."
Yeah. I mean, Scooter was all part of the same gang. But Cheney, the way it worked was that Cheney, in meetings, would never say much, or, big meetings, he would often say nothing at all. But he would then have, one-on-one meetings with Bush. And he was always, before a decision was made, Bush would talk to Cheney. But I described this phenomenon, which was, Rumsfeld would come into a meeting and they'd all decided to do, embark on one particular course of action, and then, Rumsfeld would say, "Well, I don't think that's a good idea, Mr. President, here's what we should do," and within a couple of minutes he'd have Bush agreeing with him. I think he wouldn't have done that, and it wouldn't have worked as often as it did if he didn't know ahead of time that he'd have Cheney's backing on that.
Mm-hmm.
It was a 1-2 alliance, and they really were the two guys who, ran the world.
Well, and it's really interesting because you say in your book that Condoleezza Rice, who was at that time the National Security Advisor, and Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, that they had to use back channels through the National Security Council to spy on Donald Rumsfeld just to find out what the hell he was up to on any given day.
Well, that's right. Because Rumsfeld made it absolutely his business not to... he wanted to make sure he was the sole avenue of conduit of information to Bush. It was the source of his power. So he would go completely wild if he found people in DOD giving information to the NSC, to the White House staff, or let alone the State Department. So that's why I've kind of, but they were actually having to sort of basically hack into the Pentagon's computers to find out what on earth was going on. And quite important things like when he was planning to call up the reserves and things like that. Very important things. So that was the level of secrecy, and the level of how dysfunctional this government is. I should say, it's one interesting piece of information, which was, the way the government. I'm always interested in this, in how the government's different parts of the government spy on each other. One particularly potent weapon that Cheney had is that in Cheney's office, so I've been told, the staff there, they have the ability to call up, to look into the computers of other people in the government. They can look at their calendars. So there you are, Assistant Secretary of State Horton, and someone in Cheney's office doesn't trust you, wants to see what you're up to, who you're having lunch with, and they can look on your calendar, assuming you're stupid enough to keep it on your computer, and see that, Horton is, having lunch with Cockburn. So we better not trust Horton. Anyway.
Yeah, lunch with you would be reason enough to get on his shit list, I bet.
Yeah, well, whoever. Anyway, I just pulled out there. So I think, I'm sure Rumsfeld kept Cheney informed of what he was doing. Cheney once made a joke, but I thought it was rather, telling joke. He said, most people, when they look at me, see the Vice President of the United States. When Don Rumsfeld looks at me, he sees his former assistant.
Right.
So, it's a very interesting relationship, but, incredibly potent one, with, potent in a wholly disastrous way.
Yeah. Well, and there you go again. You keep mentioning disaster and completely destroying the Middle East and all that. So let's talk about that. You write in your book that Donald Rumsfeld wanted to invade Iraq with 35,000 troops. Doesn't sound to me like he thought Iraq was much of a threat before that war.
That's right. He just thought, he just wanted to show as far as I can figure out, what he personally, Don Rumsfeld, the reason he signed on to the enterprise was that he thought this would be a great advantage. This would confirm that he, Don Rumsfeld, was a military genius, as he thought, fondly believed, and certainly told everyone, had been demonstrated in Afghanistan.
Right, which we talked about last week.
We talked about last week. But he thought he could do, Iraq would be just as easier maybe. It's all flat. So you could use lots of tanks. And you could just race to Baghdad, knock off Saddam, hand power to a bunch of generals who would then execute Saddam, and you'd leave. I think that was sort of, so far as he thought it through at all, which was, I'm not sure how much he did, but that was sort of what he had in mind, and he just played it by ear from then, and then what he really liked doing, then the military said, oh my God, you need 400,000 men, and then so he did what he enjoyed doing, which was, aggressively wearing them down, showing that he was in charge, and, the Joint Chiefs didn't know nothing, and bullying Franks, who was who was a bully himself, and bullying Franks into, accepting the force they finally went with, which was somewhere in between. But then they also, Wolfowitz, as I talk about in the book, Wolfowitz, he was fully on board for this because he wanted to leave Iraq. Well, I was going to say, first of all, he wanted to leave Iraq clear for his friend Chalabi to take over, who'd promised all this good stuff, had promised the Israelis, oil shipments from Iraq, and made a lot of promises to a lot of people, including to Paul Wolfowitz and his friend Richard Pearl. But if that didn't work, I think, and I allude to this in the book, that I think, Wolfowitz and his gang, the neocons, they were just as happy to see Iraq destroyed. In some ways, I think what's happened has been mission accomplished because, it was a big, powerful Arab state. As opposed to these little countries in the Gulf, which are like sort of sandpits, Iraq was a real formidable state with a culture and a history and an army and lots of money, potentially. I mean, Saddam was giving $25,000 to the families of suicide bombers.
Right, so, if the sanctions had been lifted, he would have been able to rebuild that state pretty quickly.
Yes, he would. So I think they were just as happy to see Iraq destroyed.
Well, let's dwell there for a moment. You actually quote Anthony Zinni, who basically had Frank's job before Frank's did, was the head of CENTCOM, as saying that that's what he believed happened here, too, that they decided Plan B, if they can't have it their way with the Hashemite king or an Ahmed Chalabi, that just go ahead and obliterate the place.
Yeah. It's... that's. I've talked to Zinni about this quite a bit, and I said, "Did you have any indication, if that?" He said no. It was just the impression he got from talking to them, that they didn't really care. I do have an indication, which I talk about in the book, which was a very prominent Shia cleric, Majid al Khoei, who was actually a friend of mine, who came to Washington just not long before the war. He lived in London, and he was from one of the very sort of distinguished Shia, Ayatollah family in Najaf, most of whom have been killed by Saddam, in fact. And he came to Washington just before the war and had talks with various people here. They went back to London and said, well, among other people, he'd met, quote-unquote, certain American Jews, which I think that's what he meant by neocons, who told him that preserving the unity of Iraq was no longer a priority of American policy, which he, being a sort of a Shia, thought was just fine. But, it shows that people here are already thinking that, we're not too it confirms that people here were not too unhappy with the idea of Iraq falling apart.
Mm-hmm. And, David Wurmser also wrote that, I believe back in 1997, that's the man who's now Dick Cheney's Middle East advisor,
right?
Wrote that what we ought to consider doing here is expediting the chaotic collapse. He said once the regime in Iraq is overthrown, that we'll have tribal and ethnic warfare, and that we ought to expedite that chaotic collapse in order that we can remake the future our way, et cetera, like that.
Yeah, although actually that's been slightly misquoted. He was mostly talking about Syria there, but I know that I'm familiar with the quote, with the way it's been quoted. I think it's what you're seeing, but if you go back to the original, he seems to be talking about Syria. But anyway, I think, it goes back to T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, who wrote in 1916 that the object of the exercise should be to overthrow the Ottoman Empire as it was then and reduce the whole area to a mosaic of small Arab states, none of which would be any threat to the British Empire, he meant, but also actually Israel. He was a very active, very convinced Zionist as well. Anyway, we don't want to lug everyone back 100 years, but this idea is long-standing.
Yeah. Well, it may even be worth going back 100 years. Greg Palast writes in his book Armed Madhouse that the basically, I guess, the American Rockefeller, Standard Oil, and English Rothschild interests that had developed oil in the Caspian fields in Russia, that they had a big meeting and drew a red line around the joint little pool of Iraq and Iranian oil there on the border.
It's called, yeah.
Yeah, and agreed we will not develop this oil. We'll do everything we can to keep this off the market, and that's been the policy since, I think, 23 or 25?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense.
We're drifting a long way from present-day Iraq, Scott. I just said
well, except that everybody's killing each other there, and no oil's getting to the market, and it seems to be working out for whether you're a neocon or an oil man at this point.
Well, this is true.
As long as you're not an Iraqi, everything's great.
Yeah. No, I mean, Iraq, just want to remind people of the situation, and we now have the WHO conference going on at the moment, or yesterday's meeting. They confirmed 21% of Iraqi children are now acutely malnourished.
Mm-hmm.
And think of that. This was, before the first Gulf War, the major pediatric, that's 1990, the major pediatric problem in Iraq, i.e. children's health problem, was obesity. They were eating too much. Now 1 in 5 is acutely malnourished. So that, when Bush talks about his legacy, I'd say that's a good candidate.
Yeah. Well, there's another article I saw yesterday that said 70% of elementary school-age children in Iraq are suffering from major trauma and symptoms like stuttering and bedwetting and that kind of thing.
Yeah. It's all, anyway.
Millions of lives ruined, that's all. It's just,
Yeah, it's just awful beyond belief.
This is to the point in your book, too, that Iraq had already been destroyed by the United States of America long before 2003. There wasn't much left of this country to invade.
Right, we've been bombing it for 12 years. We destroyed the middle class. I was thinking about this morning. Just over a month ago, March 26, 1997. It was a very important day in the history of Iraq. That's when Madeline Albright announced that economic sanctions, would remain whether or not Saddam complied, with the weapons inspectors. And, whether or not Iraq was found to have, any more weapons of mass destruction, it didn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
We were going to keep sanctions on regardless. And I happen to know I found out recently the reason why she said that, which was that Ralf Ekeus, who was then the chief UN weapons inspector, was about to say that Iraq was now free of WMD. Okay? And this is an Antiwar Radio Exclusive, I might tell you.
All right.
About to say that Ralf Ekeus was about to certify that Iraq was now free of WMD. The Clinton administration was panicked because if he said that, then economic sanctions would have to be lifted. Then the right wing here would say, Bill Clinton let Saddam get back on his feet. And, and the Israeli lobby will be up in arms. And, so the solution was for Madeleine Albright to make this, declare this policy, in which case what happened, they knew what would happen, which was Saddam would say, well, heck, I'm not going to cooperate with the UN anymore. If it doesn't matter whether I comply or not, why should I let your inspectors run around the country, because they still had some things left to do, who, as he well knew, and a lot of other people knew, were heavily infiltrated by the CIA and, MI6. There are all these, Western spies run around if there's nothing in it for me. And therefore I'm stopping cooperating. And that's why he stopped cooperating. That was a predictable and, looked for result. He stopped cooperating with the UN inspectors. So they pulled out, and then they said, And then, they said, oh, we don't know if there's any, Saddam has kicked out the UN. We don't know what he's up to. And that really set the stage for, for 2003.
Right. Well, and even for Operation Desert Fox in 1998.
Yeah. I mean, it was all, they did, the last thing they wanted was, a certification, was clear evidence that Saddam didn't have any weapons.
Right. And, in your book, you talk about also how Saddam Hussein's son-in-law had told them in 1995 that every last bit of it had been destroyed by 1991 and gave him the documents to prove it, and that then Dick Cheney and the rest of the war party, I believe Rumsfeld as well, cited him and half of his statement in order to justify the war.
Exactly. It's very important that they, I think, I could never, what Hussein Kamel, who was Saddam's son-in-law, who gave them that vital piece of intelligence, I spent a lot of time trying to find out if that was circulated at all. And people in the White House said yes, they were aware of it, but said, oh, we didn't believe him, we couldn't be sure. Well, they didn't want to believe him. But I found, a lot of other people in the government who, I said, did you know that Saddam's son-in-law, the man in charge of the weapons program, had told them in 95 that everything got thrown away in years before? They say, no one ever told us that. That was kept a secret. I mean, it's just, you can't just say one thing is criminal because the whole enterprise was so criminal. But that's just one more example of it. But yeah, no, everyone's forgotten that story. It's one of those frequent stories that people have chosen to forget about, what's happened to Iraq.
Yeah, when I first talked with Scott Ritter about that, he was just outraged because he pointed out that Dick Cheney's speech where he cited Hussein Kamel, and basically what he said was, Saddam's son-in-law admitted that they kept some weapons after the Gulf War, but then left out, but then they destroyed it a couple months later.
Yeah, that's right.
And he made that speech to the veterans of foreign wars.
Yeah.
To the guys who fought in the last few wars and who were going to be the ones sending their sons to fight in this one. He lied right to their faces.
I know. I mean, it's well.
And I don't know, I forget if you wrote about this in your book or if you, maybe you can tell me Rumsfeld's role in this, but NBC News reported that the Pentagon wanted to go to Kurdistan to kill Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and his Ansar al-Islam group before the war because, of course, Americans were welcome in Kurdistan.
Yeah.
And that they were denied permission repeatedly because they needed this excuse that he was somehow the terrorist bridge between bin Laden and Saddam.
That's right. They needed Zarqawi.
Yeah. Do you know what Rumsfeld's role in that was?
Well, I guess he was. I know Wolfowitz was very concerned about that.
About leaving him alive?
Yeah, because they need, the Zarqawi excuse.
Uh-huh.
In fact, when asked, I know that Wolfowitz was asked, after he left office, saying, well, what do you think? Do you think it was all worthwhile, invading Iraq? And he said, well, Zarqawi was already starting to operate in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So he still clings to that excuse.
And also, you write in your book about how Donald Rumsfeld was furious when, in the fall of 2003, the insurgency kept getting bigger and bigger, and I believe this is the part where you say he slammed his hand on the desk so hard that people thought he was going to break it in half.
That's right.
And he said, that's it, gloves off, no more laws, torture these people and find out who's behind this insurgency. Right,
well, yeah, that's right. I mean, what he was really wanted to find, it makes it sound like he was really, issuing orders for, ordering up empirical intelligence, so he could really find out what was really going on. I don't know. I think it's slightly, I reason to believe it's slightly different than that. He was insisting that the insurgency was Saddam, what do they call them? Former Saddam loyalists, FSLs, or dead-enders. And when people said, oh, well, maybe it's, maybe there's another reason. Maybe it's because, they don't like being occupied, or it's because, the U.S. occupation forces have behaved so badly. He would, that's what made him so angry. He wanted people tortured at Abu Ghraib, basically, so that they would then give information that would confirm what he believed and what he was telling Bush. So it's even worse than just demanding good intelligence, a lot more intelligence.
Right, it's demanding lies to back up his beliefs. That's good. And, of course, we all know, just for the record here, let me mention that the Army admitted to the Red Cross that 90% of the people in that prison were completely innocent, just rounded up off the street and tortured.
Sure, yeah.
And now, so this whole transformation, this doctrine that the Pentagon obviously is, the biggest waste of money in the history of humanity, and something's got to be done about it. But it seems to me, from reading your book, that all Rumsfeld did was come in and make everything worse. We're still producing weapon systems, multi-billion-dollar weapon systems that were ordered up in 1987 when the Soviet Union was going to exist for another 100 years.
Oh, that's right. Actually, some of them are rather older than that. The V-22, sort of tilt-rotor airplane that the Marines are about to be given, I think they've been working on that since the mid-'70s at least. But it doesn't work any better now than it did then. But that's right. I mean, Rumsfeld came in with this, with this declared policy, which Bush had announced during the campaign that they're going to transform the military and, get rid of what they called legacy systems. So this was all the sort of bright sparks in the sort of neocon organizations like the Heritage Foundation and the Project on the New American Century, who were all, a lot of them had ties, as in financial ties to defense contractors. And they were going to do all these new ways to spend money, they said. They were going to transform the military. But, nothing happened. Nothing happened for two reasons, or for various reasons. First off, Rumsfeld, I argue, is fundamentally intellectually lazy, so he couldn't really be bothered to sort of wrap his mind around what the real issues were. And secondly, the military, the institutions pushed back. They didn't want to be transformed. They like things the way they are, whatever they say about it. And they like the weapons they've ordered, the programs they have underway. They're the ones they want. Whether they have any military relevance or not is beside the point. So when Rumsfeld looked like in the early part of 2001, when he looked like he, possibly might be a threat, and he was being rude to the Joint Chiefs, and on this personal level, he was being very domineering. They fought back, they leaked lots of stuff to the press, they alerted the Congress, and by August, or certainly, by early September 2001, Rumsfeld had kind of given up on that. Not that he ever tried very hard in the first place. He'd basically given up on the idea of transforming the military. Then along comes 9/11, and he's got something else to do. Now he can be Rummy the Warlord. And people didn't sort of notice that he gave up on. He went on talking about transformation, of course, sort of squinting his eyes in the way he'd like to do, and to show how sort of wise and far-seeing he was. But actually, people on the inside will tell you that he actually basically really didn't come up much after that inside.
Yeah, well, one place they were successful, it seems like, is the propaganda campaign. You write about how they had their pet generals, pet retired generals that they would bring in and then send out to propagandize all of us on the TV news.
That they were really good at.
It's really an amazing part of the story there.
Yeah, what they did was they realized that the more and more with the more and more news, TV, demand for TV news. And commentary on these cable news shows, particularly Fox and CNN and MSNBC and so forth, there was a lot of retired military were going on and yakking away about military affairs. So they co-opted, not that they needed much co-opting, but they'd bring them in, like 2 or 3 times a week for a briefing at the Pentagon, and they'd give them a little bit of some information that hadn't been, put on the wires yet, hadn't been given to the Pentagon press corps. So then these characters could then go back to the TV studio and, sound all like inside, because they knew they had stuff that the rest of us didn't know. None of it sort of mattered that much, but it was, just to give them a patina of sort of inside knowledge. And then they were allowed, this is what was one of the things that was very clever about it, you were allowed to be a little bit of a dissident. You could say, well, I'm not sure, Rumsfeld's doing quite the right thing here. I would, advance our forces this way, maybe rather than that way. Although, of course, the whole idea of an invasion is great. You couldn't be too much of a dissident, because if you really criticized the policies, then you were cut out. No more briefings for you.
Right, which happened to Barry McCaffrey, right?
That happened to Barry McCaffrey, yeah. Much to his unhappiness, I might say. But otherwise, you could express a little doubt, but as long as you stay generally on board. So that made them that much more effective because they had the appearance of being independent.
Well, and there's some kind of military term for this, right? Total information dominance or something?
Yeah, that's, Victoria Clark, who was Rumsfeld's first assistant, secretary in charge of public affairs, who's a very smart propagandist, really, is what she is, and she's very effective. She believes. This wasn't not an idea totally original to her, but she certainly articulated it, and implemented it very effectively. The idea is to fill the vacuum, and if you produce enough information, and it should, if possible, be true. It doesn't have to be. You don't want to tell huge lies all the time because, sooner or later you get caught out. You just want to sort of give the news you want to give. You're going to keep people at the receiving end so busy that they're not going to go anywhere else. If you're a Pentagon correspondent and Victoria Clark at the Pentagon's giving you wonderful briefings all the time, telling you exactly what's going on, giving you helicopter rides, putting you up there with the frontline troops, giving you access to the commanders, you're going to be so busy and let alone happy that you're not going to bother to go around and go take time off to go ring up Scott Horton or Andrew Cockburn to see if there's a contrary view. So that was the theory they worked on, and it really worked. The ultimate thing that really worked was embedding. Clark, her idea was if you put correspondence with directly in contact with the troops, and they were living and alongside the troops during the war, that the troops, the individual the soldiers who appeared particularly on television, would be so appealing. It didn't really matter what the correspondent said or thought, because the troops would sell the war, which they did, because to see American boys in harm's way was all very exciting, and the whole embedding thing worked really well.
Right, I remember people saying that, the government can't possibly lie because the press is embedded right there with them, and it's just to prove how honest everything is, as opposed to, this just is going to make them that much easier to control.
That's right. It was very cleverly done. That was the most successful, and unfortunately the most successful part of, and there was a very political operation. They would send, Rumsfeld, would go out, as Secretary of Defense, he would go, if there was an area of the country where they wanted to shore up support, he would go there and it was like a political campaign. He'd go on local radio, local TV, he'd address civic groups, student groups, he'd spend, and the whole idea was all a very sort of, as I say, it was like a political campaign.
Yeah. Like Andrew Card, the hired help, said, that this was like selling a new fashion or something. You don't want to debut new products in August. You want to wait till later in the fall.
Yeah. That's where this whole administration thinks. But Rumsfeld was very much part of that. He particularly wanted to sell himself because Rummy, it's part of a theme in the book that Rummy, he was a failed politician.
Mm-hmm.
He had precisely one contested election in his life, which was the Republican primary for the Illinois 13th congressional district in 1962, and that was it. He never had another contested race. But he still thought he was, he loved being a politician, even though he's really actually hopeless at it.
Well, and you quote him on the day that he was made Secretary of Defense, or on the day of Bush's inauguration or something, saying, "Can you believe it? I'm back in. All right, I have a second chance.
I've got another chance." He said, got another. Can you believe it? Can you believe it? I've got another chance.
I'm only fourth in line from the presidency, or fifth.
Well, he didn't say that, but probably going through his mind. He was, he'd been a failure. Rummy had been, that's the terrible thing. We were almost rid of him.
Well, and that's all he is now, too. His legacy now is 2 lost wars and malnutrition replacing obesity as the biggest health problem among children in Iraq. That's his legacy.
That's true. One thing you always have to remember, there was a guy called, I can't remember his name. He was a guy who was made Prime Minister of France in about 1760. And everyone said, well, he won't last long because he's 89. And he lasted, I think, 6 years. So, never count them out until they're really out. I mean, perhaps Rumsfeld won't come back to haunt us, but you never know.
Well, last I heard, he still has an office at the Pentagon. He's not even all the way gone yet, is he?
Yeah, it's a DOD office. I think it's actually in Roslyn, but, it's DOD personnel going through his papers. Well, but he's still, I just wonder what conversations go on over the garden fence between him and Cheney, out on the Maryland Eastern Shore.
That's a nightmarish thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I have to thank you very much for your time today. Andrew Cockburn is the author of Rumsfeld, His Rise, Fall, and Catastrophic Legacy. Thanks.
Okay, Scott, you're welcome.